At AHN, we see you at your healthiest, rocking out while you work out, and tuning into soft rock as you rest up from the flu. We see you reliving the good old days with throwbacks, and replaying that shark song for your kids again and again. We see you blasting ballads to get you through, and searching for an AHN doctor as you listen to the next song. Visit ahn.org to get started.
This Memorial Day weekend, get ready for fun when Nemacolin welcomes the Beach Boys to the peak stage. Spend the weekend relaxing in the spa, perfecting your swing on the golf course, soaking in one of the 4 pools, or ziplining through the forest, and then cap it all off with the luau-themed event featuring Grammy Award-winning band The Beach Boys. Overnight and VIP packages are available. Visit nemacolin.com for more information.
Hello, this is Albert Einstein. History myths fly around at the speed of light. Especially with that new internet thing you all seem to have. Thank goodness I have a direct connection to Professor Buzzkill, a fellow deep thinker who busts myths and takes names. I'm totally stoked. There's a new episode. I was stuck on this new equation anyway. E equals mc something. Something.
Once again, it's time for Professor Buzzkill, the greatest history podcast in the entire universe. And I'm here with your favorite history professor, Professor Nash. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be associated with such superlatives.
That's us. You know, we talk a lot about American history on this show. Obviously, our audience is mostly American. And the subject of African Americans in American history keeps coming up again and again and again. And it's almost never a good story. It's almost always disheartening, dealing with rights being either taken away or dealing with slavery, things like that. It just seems as if it never gets any better historically for African Americans. Does it have an up and a down?
It does get better, and that's despite a lot of the stuff I'm about to say. People should try. It's hard, but should try to keep that in mind. That there is, better. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, there is an arc of history, and it does tend toward justice. Although I know he didn't coin that phrase.
Yeah, we have to be careful.
Sorry, didn't mean to imply that.
Yeah.
But
he's credited as saying it.
I mean, if you look at the condition of Black America in 2018. And you compare it to any other period, obviously we have made great progress.
Okay, all right, because it often seems like it's a never-ending tragedy.
Right, and as bad as things often seem today, that to me, that's one of the points of historical consciousness is that it provides context.
Right.
And today we're going to provide some context which is far grimmer than anything you would see today. But people should also just know about this period. But part of the thing is that I think it doesn't get taught as much or doesn't get the coverage it deserves because it is so grim and unpleasant in some ways. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, if you look, there is plenty of uplift to be found.
Right.
There are positive stories, there are inspirational stories, there are people who do good work and get and help achieve progress, and that there are, including white people, by the way.
Sure.
But this is the period of, it's called the nadir by historians, which is the opposite of zenith. It means the low point. Yeah. And obviously, when you hear that, you might think, okay, wait, what about slavery? Yeah. Obviously, slavery is the low point. Yeah. This refers to the low point in African American history post-slavery.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. And post-slavery, by post-slavery, we don't really mean 1865 when the Civil War is over. We mean 1877.
That's right. So post-slavery and post-reconstruction. So in other words, if you are periodizing Black history, right, there's the slavery period, which ends in 1865. Yeah. And there's Reconstruction, which is the next 12 years until 1877. The period after that, bridging into the 20th century, where you would end it, we could debate about that. I would say maybe roughly 1920. Okay. But because in some ways it lasts until the Civil Rights Movement, if you look at some of the realities. Absolutely. But this period is called the nadir. This is the period when Reconstruction is over, Southern Blacks, and by the way, well into the 20th century, we're talking about 80 to 90% of the entire Black American population. just for context.
80 to 90?
The vast majority of blacks live in the South well into the 20th century. And by the way, this period is so bad, that's why it's going to change. In other words,
I see.
Where that percentage is going to drop as African Americans will leave. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But basically, what I mean, after 1877, these millions of African Americans in the South are left to the tender mercies of Southern whites, the Southern white majority. I'm gonna be using shorthand like Southern whites. Southern whites are like all people; they're much more diverse than any one label. Yeah, sure. You have some. Well, they're mostly secret white Republicans in this period. You have...
And of course, Republicans means members of the Republican Party in the 1880s, 70s, 80s.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
But basically what happens, the story of the Nadir is, especially, not immediately, it takes a while, it's gradual. It's on, by definition, it's on the state and local level. But gradually, especially after 1890, a comprehensive system of race oppression is put in place.
Comprehensive,
which is to say a system of race oppression where African Americans kept underfoot, subservient, exploited, kept in an inferior position, and it's a trap. There's as we'll see with a couple of his sections, there's no way out, and it marks virtually every aspect of your life and of your society as an African American living in the South.
Yeah, I see on the outline that you've given us here. There's everything: economic subservience, disenfranchisement, segregation, popular culture, terror, and lynching. It is almost as if everything about your life is not only defined by other people but prescribed by other people.
And if you look back on it, like take a step back and look at the big picture, you could be excused for thinking that this was put in place by a single evil criminal mastermind.
Right.
I mean, that's not. It was much more organic than that. It was much more gradual.
Yeah.
It just, in some ways, it sort of happened, but it ends up being a complete system of race oppression. It's not. It's not partial. It doesn't have holes in it. It ensures complete white dominance of the black population.
Right. Into the 20th century.
Well into the 20th century. Well into the 20th century. In some ways, to the midpoint of the 20th century.
Yeah,
so decades. Right. So let me just go through these. You could do an entire show on each of these, by the way.
Yeah, that's right.
So we are, just so people know, I'm not at all aiming for comprehensiveness here. This is the Sparks Notes version. So first of all, economic subservience. African Americans have few, if any, economic opportunities. Most black Southerners after 1877 are sharecroppers.
Right. Now let's remind them what that is.
Yeah, they're tenant farmers, and what they do is they pay rent in the form of a share of the crop.
Right.
So partly because they have no other resources.
Right.
The only way they can pay rent is by handing over a portion of the crop, whether it's cotton or rice or tobacco or whatever. It's complicated, but very quickly a lot of them become trapped in lifelong debt, partly because they often have to borrow money from a local monopoly lender, often in the form of a general store. There's no banking system, really.
Sure.
And so a lot of them end up, basically, when it comes time to pay their share of the crop is 100%. And so then they have no money left over for themselves and have to borrow, and then they just go deeper and deeper into debt. And this is part of the economic exploitation, right? In other words, the system is set up to make sure these people are tied down in debt. Now, by the way, it also describes a fair number of white people.
Yeah.
The South remains economically underdevelopment. A lot of poor whites are also tenant farmers and sharecroppers, but they have the advantage of their white skin color.
Right.
Let's never forget that.
Right.
You also have this thing which has gotten a lot of attention in recent years called convict leasing. And remember, what white Southerners are doing is they're trying to come up with a substitute for slavery. They lost 4 million free laborers, and by that I mean they don't have to pay for them. They don't have to pay them a wage.
When this 13th Amendment is passed.
When slavery is abolished in 1865. So they're trying to come up with a substitute. Sharecropping is in effect one substitute. Who's going to pick my cotton? And I don't have to pay them much, if anything.
Yeah.
Okay. Convict leasing is another aspect of this. Thousands of African-American men are arrested, often on bogus, trumped-up charges.
After the war?
After 1877. This becomes. I would argue it's the original mass incarceration.
Ugh.
Thousands of African-American men, usually able-bodied young men, are arrested, almost always convicted because they're all white juries before too long, and often for crimes they didn't even commit, given punitive sentences, multi-year sentences, sometimes multi-decade sentences.
These are like the vagrancy laws and things
vagrancy
like that?
laws, exactly.
Yeah.
Drunk disorderly, right? The disorderly conduct, often sort of completely bogus charges. And then they're sentenced to prison or jail, and then they are leased out to local landowners to provide agricultural labor.
Convict labor.
That's a substitute for slavery.
Yeah,
the landowner pays the prison very, very little money. The prisoner gets no money, and often they're kept in sort of medieval conditions.
Right. Yeah.
Or read about some place like Parchman Farm in the Mississippi Delta. There's a whole book about that. The title of the book is Worse Than Slavery.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the conditions, not too far off the mark.
In fact, isn't one of the subclauses of the 13th Amendment the slavery is prohibited except for punishment of a crime?
That's right.
Yeah.
Which they had to put in there.
Sure, otherwise it wouldn't be ratified.
But it does provide a loophole. And then keep in mind, underlying any economic system is an educational system, which is a disaster for African Americans. Leaving aside the fact that a lot of African American kids can't properly go to school because to support the family they have to be pulled out of school to help with the work.
Sure, yeah.
Which
absolutely.
is also true of a lot of poor white families, but even more so for poor black families. If you look at the South, here's a factoid as of 1916, African American schools received less than a third of the funding that white Southern schools received per pupil.
Right.
And by the way, the white Southern figure is way low compared to the rest of the country. Let's keep that in mind as well. So these are some, dilapidated one-room schoolhouses with no heat and using hand-me-down white textbooks that are 40 years out of date, et cetera, et cetera. So remember, especially in our country, one of the few ways forward economically is to become educated.
Right.
So let's not forget that. So that is taken away. So there's a system of economic subservience. On top of that, there is, especially after 1890, systematic disenfranchisement, which is to say African Americans who, remember, had been given the vote during Reconstruction,
right,
due to the 15th Amendment, through a series of ploys are denied the vote.
Now, why do you say after 1890?
By 1890, all these big D Democrat governments are firmly back in charge.
Oh, and
starting. It takes them a while for them to get up and running and then get in a situation where they, for example, can rewrite their state constitutions.
Finagling these things in. Okay.
Right, and passing new laws in order to disenfranchise black people. Keep in mind that the 15th Amendment is worded negatively.
And the 15th Amendment is?
It's supposed to give black people the vote, black men, that is.
Right.
It's phrased negatively, which is to say the right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Right.
Which, if you're a lawyer, cries out for the exploitation of loopholes. So what the White South
did, shall not,
they should have said, black people get the vote.
Yeah, right.
They didn't.
Yeah.
They said, you can't remove the vote from them on this basis. What are you going to do? Remove it on some other basis.
Yeah.
And so the White South comes up with a series of laws, 3 basic laws. One will be the poll tax.
Yeah.
Charge people money in order to vote. Well, black people don't have any money. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're wondering, what about poor whites? Well, who's making these laws? Not just any white people, but rich white people.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a twofer. It's class warfare from above. And a lot of, and in these laws, a lot of poor whites are also disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
Literacy tests.
And again, we mean effectively disenfranchised. There's no law that says we're taking the vote away.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like if someone said, what about the 15th Amendment? You say, well, I'm not denying it based on race. I'm denying it based on the inability to pay a poll tax. Yeah. Technically legal under the 15th Amendment. Same with the literacy test, which, by the way, in the early 20th century was packaged as a progressive reform, right? Who do you want voting? Yeah. You only want people who, are educated. And to be educated, you have to be able to read.
And this might be a spur to education because you want, in theory.
Now, these were also, in practice, were not evenly executed. In other words, white people were not given the literacy test, which is good because a lot of whites were illiterate. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if a black person came in to be examined and proved they could read, then they would have to prove they were a constitutional scholar. And the local investigator or sheriff would start quizzing them on the Constitution.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, the local sheriff didn't know either, but he's got it in front of him.
there was no standard test.
So seriously, so what's Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution? If you couldn't answer that question, you couldn't vote.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's that. And then my favorite, exactly, I can't either. My favorite is, it's like today, like how many citizens could pass a citizenship test.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But then there's my favorite, the grandfather clause. Some states passed laws that said you can vote if your grandfather could vote.
Now, how come this wasn't abolished by the 15th Amendment? I guess it's not in one of those
You're
reasons.
not discriminating based on race, color, previous conditions of servitude. You're being disenfranchised based on your grandfather's status. Technically legal.
Yeah.
No, it's perfectly transparent. And by the way, and this is the most finely tuned instrument. This won't catch any white people up in it. Unlike the first two.
Their grandfathers could vote.
Their grandfathers could vote because they were white, right?
So these are laws that are actually passed by state legislatures.
Absolutely. Okay. And put on the books. They're this is not informal discrimination. This is formal.
Right,
This is in black and white. It's on paper. And so obviously the status of almost all African Americans in the South is your grandfather was a slave. Your grandfather was property. Of course, you couldn't vote. Therefore, you can't. And once again, spun as a progressive reform, right? Yeah. We want people voting who have a stake in the community and who have been here a while and blah, blah, blah. And yet it's the exact opposite of progressive. So by the time you get to the early 20th century, the number of African Americans who are registered to vote in a place like Mississippi, you could probably fit in your house.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, there were a few people who could register, but they're token, literally token.
Right.
And then on top of that, once you've denied black people to vote, and so they can't fight back in politics, you can then set about segregating society. And this is where the South becomes Jim Crowed.
Yes. Okay.
Right from the minstrel show. This is the label put on the South, Jim Crow. In other words, rigid, formal segregation of all aspects of public life. Right, people have seen photos of the 2 drinking fountains.
Yes.
The 2 parts of the bus, right? The segregated movie theater, the restaurant, and everything. And I mean everything in public life is segregated.
Yeah,
entire generations of African Americans didn't know how to swim because they were banned from public swimming pools.
Yeah. Yep.
The blood supply was segregated.
Now that's an interesting thing. That's a shocking thing to most modern people. That blood, which is the only color of blood is red, is that it's literally segregated.
Yep.
You're not type A, type B. You're type A white, type B white.
Mm-hmm. And you paid a lot of attention to keeping that blood supply segregated. And every phase of your life, from the maternity ward in the hospital. And by the way, if you look at the biography of someone like Bessie Smith, the famous jazz singer, who was in a bad car accident and bled out because she wouldn't be admitted to the local white hospital, allegedly. Graveyards are segregated.
Yeah.
Our military, segregated until after World War II. Let's not forget. We fought against the Nazis on behalf of a segregated society, including in the military. By the way, where white Southerners usually put in charge of black units because they knew how to, quote unquote, handle their Negroes. You can imagine the morale or the effectiveness of that unit. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. This unit doesn't fight very hard. Well, why do you think that is?
Why should they? Yeah.
They're not very well led. They're not inspired, etc. So, and of course, let's not forget that the legal system is also rigidly segregated.
Which should ultimately be the most fair, and it isn't.
Yes, right. You have all white juries. Black people cannot serve on juries. Black people accused of crime are almost always convicted. Whites committing crimes against blacks are almost never charged.
Yeah,
much less convicted, right? So basically, you have if you're a white criminal and want to victimize black people, you go right ahead. And just to show the disdain of the whites, black on black crime is typically not taken very seriously or prosecuted by the white legal system. Because we, quote unquote, we white people just don't care.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Let them hurt each other.
Yeah. So why would we waste any resources policing the black community?
Yeah. Oh.
And let's not forget that this is all signed off on by the U.S. Supreme Court itself in 1896 with one of its most infamous decisions ever, Plessy v. Ferguson.
Right.
In which, quote unquote, separate but equal is enshrined in U.S. law, even though everyone knew, except the one dissenting justice apparently, because it was an 8-1 decision, that separate was never equal, and the whole purpose of separate was to make it unequal. But this was the law of the land, right? All other legal efforts were basically discouraged by this decision for the next almost 60 years, until 1954. All of this is reinforced by popular culture, by things like the Lost Cause, right? That the Confederate cause was pure, and that slavery wasn't so bad, and black people deserve to be subordinate, et cetera, et cetera.
Which keeps coming up in American history. That just it's a myth that will not die.
It is unavoidable, unfortunately. But if you look at American popular culture, and by that I mean things like entertainment, advertising, the media, it's so relentlessly racist, right? And sometimes you like the black lawn jockey, the mammy figure, Aunt Jemima, Step and Fetch It, Uncle Ben, all of these tropes. They're not harmless. Quite the contrary. They all reinforce the system of racism. It's a way of teaching young white people, to hate black people. You have a whole series for years, greeting cards, where humor is derived from depicting young black children being consumed by alligators. You know, like where the alligator has his mouth open and the tongue says the word well, like it's a welcome mat, and the little black kid is about to step in. That's hilarious for white people. So-called coon songs at a time when sheet music and making your own music was so popular. Forget about popular culture, or at least that was parts of it. There's also this whole series of facets to the racist etiquette that you're supposed to follow.
Yeah, especially in the South.
Right. It's whole over from the slave days. This series, for example, you never look a white person in the eye if you're a black person.
Yeah.
You preface all your remarks with yes, sir, no, sir.
Yeah.
You never speak until spoken to. You yield on the sidewalk to any white person. These are all part of a racial code meant to humiliate and degrade on a daily basis and to establish white superiority in all ways to a petty level.
Yeah.
And violation of this etiquette could have gross consequences for you.
Oh, sure.
Which leads me to my last bit here. All of the aforementioned is reinforced and backed up by a system of terror.
Yeah.
Primarily in the form of lynching, but also lesser forms of violence. This is the heyday of American lynching. We could do a whole show on this.
Yeah.
It's, apart from slavery itself and treatment of Native Americans, easily the most disgraceful episode in American history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where extra-legal murder, sometimes by mob, sometimes by small group, sometimes with the knowledge, often with the knowledge or participation of law enforcement itself.
Yeah.
We have good stats, we have good stats about the lynchings we know about.
Yeah.
We're talking about almost 5,000 lynchings between 1882 and 1968.
Oh.
Vast majority of them grouped in the last decade of the 19th and the first 2 decades of the 20th centuries.
Oh, okay. So we're talking about 1880s to 1920s.
That's right. So the pace is not uniform. It starts to fade as a practice by the time you get to the 1920s.
Yeah.
And then by the time you get to the 1950s, it's rare. You'll still see it, but it's rare.
Yeah.
In the 1890s and early 1900s, it's incredibly common. In the 1890s, every 2 or 3 days, there's a lynching somewhere. More in some places than others.
Yeah.
Good studies on this. It's more common where you have a big black population.
Also Mississippi and...
yes, Mississippi and South Carolina, places like that.
Yeah.
In the Deep South. It's more common in eras of economic distress.
Okay.
Where, in other words, white people sort of take out their economic frustrations on black people. 3/4 of the victims are black. Not all of them.
Yeah,
but 3/4.
A huge percentage.
A huge majority. There are white people who are lynched. There were 9 Italian immigrants who were lynched in New Orleans in 1891 in one incident.
Yeah.
In the West, often it was like, cattle rustlers or whatever.
Yeah.
These are the lynchings we know about. A lot of them were undocumented. 85% of them were in the South.
That, again, is a
vast
shocking
majority.
Percentage.
And often these were announced in advance. Sometimes they were large events that had the atmosphere of a county fair.
And hence why the cooperation of law enforcement, as you mentioned a second ago.
Right. There's a whole... these days, there's a lot of study just of lynch photography.
Yes.
There are entire books on this subject.
Yeah.
Sometimes picture postcards were made.
Yeah. Strange Fruit, the song.
Right.
About that.
There was at least one urban lynching I read about. A crowd of 10,000 people assembled.
Wow. 10,000.
10,000 people. Often they would build a scaffold. Often the victims were tortured to death, not just killed.
Oh.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to get into the details. It's as grim as you can imagine. The forms of humiliation and brutality and dismemberment and, using blowtorches and lynching an entire family, the kids first in front of the parents. I mean, if you can imagine a barbarous way of killing somebody,
sure.
The lynch mob came up with it. And by the way, this should not be understood as vigilantism. This is not quote-unquote rough justice.
No.
This is terror.
Yeah.
This is, and we even have quotes from the leaders of lynch mobs where they basically say we need to set an example so that other African Americans don't quote-unquote step out of line.
preemptive
this is knowing terror. In other words, not just violence, it's terror, right? You're trying to intimidate an entire population, especially black men. And of course, the whole trope here is that white people think this is necessary to protect young white women from black rapists. You see this in Birth of a Nation.
Yep.
You see this throughout the culture. It's based on nothing, but it's a way of justifying this brutal terror, which keeps the rest of the system intact.
Right.
Because if you agitate, if you talk about politics, if you try to threaten or confront this system of race oppression, they will not hesitate to inflict the ultimate punishment on you.
Yeah.
Right. It costs your life. And so for decades, black parents raised their kids to act in a certain way.
Yeah.
To avoid this sort of violence, right?
Yeah.
Here's how you interact with white people. Don't ever do this. Don't ever do this. Don't ever do this. Because, as a human being, you expect equality, and then you have to be told how to behave in this system of race oppression.
Right.
So, like I said, this is all pretty disgraceful, and it goes on for decades.
Well, not the most positive note on which to go for a sponsorship break, but we do have to do that. And so we'll be back in a moment. Okay, we're back. Professor, this is so bad, as you've talked about. It's the nadir for African Americans in the United States. Why, if we know all this stuff, why are there so many myths about it?
Right. And once again, I don't know if these rise to the level of myth, but one myth or misconception, or is almost, I would say, an act of omission rather than an act of commission.
Well, this qualifies under our definition of a myth.
And that is, I think this, because it's so depressing and so, in a way, sort of relentless in its negativity, I think this often gets dropped either in books or by school teachers because it's just really unpleasant. It's, apart from things like I said, apart from slavery or treatment of the Indians, it's one of the things we would least like to admit about ourselves and about our past because it seems like there's so little so few redeeming features to it. So
it's more of a case of ignorance,
right? Exactly. I think a lot of people. If I'm assuming that some people who would listen to what I just laid out, they might be surprised about how just awful it is.
Yeah, right.
In other words, they might have a general sense that it's bad and the white and the black people weren't treated equally, but I think they might be surprised by just how comprehensive and relentless and thoroughgoing it is, just from top to bottom, right to left.
Complete.
And inescapable. Yeah, and complete. That's just my sense. I could be wrong, and I'm sure there's some people who know these parts of that. The more important myth, and you see this in other cases, you see this in slavery, and you see this during the Civil War, when, for example, you still see people who talk about emancipation as being this unilateral act by white people toward black people.
Right.
In other words, like the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln waved his magic wand and ended slavery.
Right.
And in all of these cases, you should never view African Americans as merely passive victims to their fate, waiting to be saved.
Yeah.
It's really important. African Americans, like all people in history, have agency, as we say in history business.
They're
they have
able
agency.
to do things to help.
They do things to help themselves. They make the best of a bad situation. They did what they could under the worst, apart from slavery, the worst possible circumstances.
Yes, before the break you mentioned kids are brought up to behave in certain ways to avoid these terrible things.
Yeah, and let's keep in mind that even in the economic sphere, because there were people like Booker T. Washington arguing for economic self-help, right? Enrich yourself, create a business. There were cases where this is what got I.D.B. Wells, the great anti-lynching crusader, started, is that three black people she knew who ran a business were lynched because they were economic competition.
Yeah.
So at the same time, you've got white people saying, well, you should work on your own thing and, work hard and get ahead. You're not allowed to get ahead even.
Yeah.
Right. So even that avenue is closed off, right? Because we're all about bootstraps, right? We're all about working hard and doing better than your parents did. African Americans, in a lot of cases, can't even do that.
Right.
There were some success stories. There was, what was it?
Let's say they were certainly prevented from doing that because of this all-encompassing system.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there was certainly, it was an enormous obstacle to economic self-improvement. No question. Even though there were some people who did manage it, it was in spite of the system, not because of the system.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I'll put it that way. They did, but African Americans did what they could. They continued to build their communities. And which they have no choice but to do because of segregation.
Absolutely.
Right? And so you do have a small black middle and professional class that develops. Right? Black doctors and black lawyers and black dentists. And by the way, just parenthetically, when you get to the civil rights movement, a few of these African Americans are going to be among the only African American opponents of the civil rights movement.
Oh, because
they actually benefited from Jim Crow. This doesn't get a lot of attention, maybe for obvious reasons, but you do, like in a place like Birmingham, you do have a few middle-class blacks who sort of wait back on the sidelines and don't take part in the movement. That's partly because they realize that if you do away with Jim Crow, they'll have to compete against all the white doctors and white dentists, and they don't exactly relish the prospect.
Yikes.
Yeah, so there are always complications here. Anyway, but they build their communities and build their churches.
Yeah, the churches are a really big thing.
You cannot exaggerate their importance. Mm-hmm. Because these churches are basically the only major social institutions that African Americans are allowed to have.
Right. Yeah.
You're not allowed to you're not allowed to take part in politics. In other words, not only can you not vote, you're not allowed to agitate.
Right.
You'll be stomped on.
Right.
The only organizations of any kind you're really allowed are churches.
Yeah.
And it's not a coincidence that they will be the basis of the modern, quote-unquote, modern civil rights movement, because that's where African Americans have been basically building institutions for decades.
And that's where they can congregate, and that's where they can, in largest numbers.
That's right. And you also have an entire generation of civil rights leaders that emerged from this period.
Right.
They're not at all on the same page. Could do a whole show on this vigorous debate among black civil rights. It's broadly similar to disputes you see later between people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But you have Booker T. Washington on the one hand, you have W.E.B. Du Bois on the other hand. You have vigorous debate, sometimes a bitter debate among the leaders about what approach do you take.
Right.
But you also have the founding of modern civil rights organizations like the NAACP.
Yeah.
National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Right.
Founded in 1909, by the way, largely in response to a major race riot in the North.
Oh, okay.
Springfield, Illinois, 1908 was a race riot. And by the way, race riot is kind of euphemism. In this period, a race riot is when armed whites invade a black area and start beating and killing people.
Oh, okay.
They're not as even as you might imagine. But the NAACP was founded with a largely white leadership at first, by the way.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. Du Bois was one of the few, if not the only, black person who was among the original leadership. That's going to change later on. But this is crucial long-term because the NAACP is going to lead the legal struggle against Jim Crow.
That's right, yeah.
There's a direct line from this event and the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision in which Jim Crow in schools is overturned in 1954. That struggle takes decades, and that's what the NAACP focuses on. They also have a very prominent anti-lynching campaign.
Yes, IDB Wells, as you mentioned.
IDB Wells, that they wage for decades, right? Anti-lynching bills are introduced to Congress. They always die in the Senate because of Southern filibusters.
Yeah.
But they are brought because of outside pressure by people in the African-American community working to improve their own situation. And finally, you also have in this period increasing incidences where African-Americans fight back against violence and race riots.
Now, by fight back, you mean fight back physically
fight back.
Yeah, okay.
And you see this, for example, in the race riot of 1906 in Atlanta, where the white mob is actually stopped at the edge of the black community because they're met with gunfire.
Wow.
Or if you look, fast forward to the so-called Red Summer of 1919, where you have a whole bunch of race riots, the worst of them in Chicago, where it's like 100 people are killed.
Oh, my goodness.
These are awful events because of the racial tensions that goes along with black migration. But there are a fair number of white people killed in these race riots, which you wouldn't necessarily have seen as much earlier. So there are ways within this horrible context, there are ways in which African Americans are trying to find their way, trying to take charge of their lives, trying to push back a little bit, trying to improve themselves. Often not look at the civil rights leaders, often they're not very successful.
Right.
But that's just a measure of the odds are up against.
It has to go on for another 4 decades.
Exactly. It's not for lack of effort.
Yeah.
That struggle has to be a long, protracted struggle and has to start somewhere. And it starts here under the most discouraging circumstances.
Okay, well, let's take a little break for station identification, and we'll get back and we'll talk about perhaps the most prominent popular response to this comprehensive situation.
Hello, this is Antonia Buzzkill. Please support my daddy by going to professorbuzzkill.com and clicking on the Patreon button. While you're there, subscribe to his email list, and shop the Buzzkill bookshelf. Follow him on Facebook, on Twitter at BuzzkillProf, and on Instagram at Professor Buzzkill. Professor Buzzkill is part of Entertainment One's podcast network and is available on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and all major podcast apps. Please leave a review while you're there. Thanks for listening.
Okay, Professor, you've talked about how comprehensive this African-American nadir is well into the 20th century. And there is the most effective way is something we want to wrap up with here. And what is that?
Well, it turns out, especially when you get to the time of World War I, which breaks out in Europe in 1914, a solution, not for all and not for the majority, but for a significant minority of blacks in the South, a solution offers itself in the form of the Great Migration.
Okay, the Great Migration, okay.
Which is to say African Americans leaving the South permanently for the Northeast, for the Midwest, and to a lesser extent to the Far West.
Okay.
In other words, going to all parts of the country that aren't the South.
Does this last longer than just World War I?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, depending on how you measure it, demographically in terms of, because you can look at census data.
Yeah,
demographically, it doesn't end until 1970.
Oh, 1970, okay.
And in more recent years, I don't know how big it is, but I know that in recent years, a fair number of African Americans have actually been moving back to the South.
Right. Yes. That's been noted.
So but that's pales in comparison to the larger Great Migration. It's actually one of the biggest demographic shifts in all of American history of any kind.
Okay.
It starts slowly at first after 1900. It picks up a lot of speed once World War I starts because there are so many jobs being created in the North. Now remember, there are jobs being created related to the war before we actually join the war.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because demand for American goods by the warring European countries goes to the
shoots
roof.
Way up. Yeah.
And especially after we joined the war in 1917, where we're drafting, 4 million men into the armed forces, the labor shortage in the North becomes epic. And you have northern firms who actually send recruiters to the South into the Mississippi Delta saying, you want a job in the North?
So it's two things.
I'll pay for your ticket.
So it's not just these new industries, but the men leaving in 1917.
That's right. Which is going to cause some of the racial tension after the war ends. When returning soldiers come and find their jobs have been taken by black people.
Okay.
But migration scholars always talk about push and pull factors.
Yeah.
Here, we shouldn't be surprised to find the migration take place because you have both.
Yeah.
In other words, you have these horrible conditions in the South,
the push factor,
which are compounded in the short term by things like the boll weevil, which decimates the cotton economy. Yeah. So the cotton economy, which has already oppressed black people, it gets even worse around 1915.
Yeah.
And on top of that, just these horrible conditions in the South. People realize they can vote with their feet. They can go to the North, and the North offers certain attractions. There's a lot of hype that goes through the black community, and they start talking about the North as the promised land.
Okay.
Once again, they use biblical terms. It's the promised land. And stories spread about, how awesome it is in the North. Now, when black people get to the North, they find out it's not entirely awesome.
Yeah.
You do have race riots in the North, in places like Springfield, Illinois, which are created because of this migration.
Yeah.
In other words, you have northern whites who look down their noses at southern whites, but quickly discover their own racism when a black person moves in. And that leads to a lot of racial tension.
Springfield, the home of Lincoln, isn't it?
Yeah, a little ironic, I think.
Yeah.
But basically, we're talking about 750,000 people who move from south to north in the first 2 decades of the 20th century.
Wow.
That is a major migration. That's a huge chunk of the black population overall. Most black Southerners remain in the South, but large numbers leave.
Mm-hmm.
Often it was a kind of chain migration, like the family would send one person north to get established.
Sure, yeah, right.
They'd make a little bit of money, send money back for train tickets.
Place to go.
By the way, there were cases where white Southerners tried to get in the way of this because they understood that some of their cheap labor force was leaving.
Yeah.
There were cases where the entire black family would show up at the train station with their tickets and their luggage, and the local sheriff would come, arrest them, throw them in jail long enough so they missed their train, and then release them.
This is the comprehensive
so just the sort of harassment and goes on and on and on. But so the North was not the promised land, just so we're clear. You had de facto segregation, you had all sorts of discrimination, you had racist white police forces, you had de facto housing segregation, et cetera, et cetera.
And then just plain racism.
And race riots. Nevertheless, just look at the economics.
Uh-huh.
If you got a factory job in the North as a black person, you would be the last hired, first hired, Often they're menial jobs, right? You're cleaning toilets rather than working on the assembly line.
First fired, you mean?
Sorry.
You said last hired, last hired, first hired.
Oops. Last hired, first fired. But still, your factory job as a black person in Detroit in 1917 might be $3 a day.
Yeah.
Picking cotton in the Mississippi Delta, you were making 50 cents a day.
Oh, Lord.
So buzzkillers out there, imagine your paycheck being multiplied 6-fold overnight. Yeah. You would put up with a lot of nonsense to take that new paycheck. You might actually be able to raise a family on that amount of money.
Yeah.
And there's also no rigid Jim Crow in the North. You don't have the rigid segregation. It's much more relaxed. Right. You're not constantly looking over your shoulder as a black person. And let's not forget, in the North, you could vote as a black person.
Okay, you're saying there weren't these poll taxes and things like that?
Right. Yeah. No, there were so few black people that white people didn't even care.
Right. Yeah.
And the fact that it's interesting, the fact you have de facto segregation in the North, for example, all blacks living in Chicago live in one part of Chicago.
Right.
That means at the local level, you start to see political power in very short order. And you'll be able to elect a black alderman or a black to the city council whose vote might matter, and then you can start getting goodies for your constituent.
And the vote has to be courted by other people, by other politicians.
And so, lo and behold, 1928, we see an African-American return to the U.S. Congress for the first time since 1901.
Wow.
Oscar DePriest, I think it was his name. And he's not coincidentally, he's from the North. He's not from the South. Right during Reconstruction, you had blacks in politics from the South. Last one is driven out in 1901. George White, I think his name was. Big critic of lynching. So after more than a quarter century, we have blacks back in Congress, only a few at first. It is really hard. There's some great books about the Great Migration out there, by the way. A recent one is called The Warmth of Other Suns by a journalist, last name Wilkerson, I believe. Fabulous book. The Great Migration changes America permanently in many, many ways, right? It nationalizes the black population the way it had never been before. Accelerated by basically everything good and bad. And by that I mean the boom of the 20s accelerates it. The Great Depression accelerates it as black people leave for the cities like everybody else looking for jobs. World War II accelerates it. A lot of black people move to the cities for the good factory jobs, including out west. Right? Places like Oakland, California get a big black population. Because World War II really only stops in 1970. This is one of the most encouraging signs to me. This is agency. This is rank and file. This is common black folk that you and I have never heard about and will never hear about, taking matters into their own hands, voting with their feet, doing what is possible to find a better life for themselves in this unfortunate situation.
Going north or sometimes west.
Going north, right, where it's not perfect, but it's so much better they don't look back. And so it's not an exaggeration to say that this is in terms of demographic history, this is one of the biggest things in all of American history, white, black, or otherwise. Changes America permanently in lots of ways, but it doesn't solve every problem, and in a lot of ways the struggle continues, right? We still haven't achieved racial equality.
No.
We're not nearly where we were during the African-American Nadir. That's the good news.
Yeah.
I mean, we really have seen night and day progress. But if you look at any measure, if you look at the economic stats, if you look at law enforcement, if you look at the legal system, if you look at opportunity, et cetera, the rates of incarceration, to pick your measure, we are not nearly there yet.
Right.
But we've made a lot of progress, no question.
Well, Professor, it's always good to have you on the show. We always get wonderful reviews from our listeners. And we hope to have you back soon to talk about many, many more things that need talking about.
We'll be happy to. We'll be happy to.
Thank you, Buzzkillers, and we'll talk to you next week.